On behalf of the Russell Sage Foundation, the Sloan Foundation, and Princeton University, welcome back to Nerd Camp. The Summer Institute in Computational Social Science. So today we're beginning into a more substantive part of the program, and today we're going to talk about collecting digital trace data. And before I say a little bit more about how we've come to think about digital trace data here at SICSS, I'm just going to go over the schedule for today's program. So first I'll say a little bit about what digital trace data is. Then I'll have a lot to say about the strengths and weaknesses of digital trace data. A lot of the people participating in SICSS this year come from either a data science or a social science background, and I think a focus on the strengths and weaknesses helps us anticipate some of the common objections that, say, a reviewer might give you to a piece in our field. Issues around representativeness, issues around algorithmic confounding, drift, and so on. Next, we'll begin to talk about actual techniques. We're going to learn screen scraping in R, and then we'll have a brief coffee break. We'll come back, we'll use application programming interfaces. We're going to collect data from Twitter, and we'll use some of that in tomorrow's exercises. And then finally, we'll have a discussion of what I consider to be the cutting edge of the field, and that is building apps and bots for social science research. And I'll talk about some popular recent studies and also share some concrete tips for building apps in both RStudio's Shiny platform as well as Google's Flutter platform. Okay, so getting right into it. What is digital trace data? So when we did our citation analysis of the field that I shared with you yesterday, you probably saw a lot of work by economists, computer scientists, and psychologists and sociologists, but you didn't see many physicists in there, which is funny because a person who could be credited with kind of founding our field, or at least partially contributing to the founding of our field, is Duncan Watts. And Duncan Watts wrote this about 8 years ago. He wrote, "Just as the invention of the telescope revolutionized the study of the heavens, so too by rendering the unmeasurable measurable, the technological revolution in mobile, web, and internet communications has the potential to revolutionize our understanding of ourselves and how we interact." 300 years after Alexander Pope argued that the proper study of mankind should lie in not the heavens but in ourselves, we have finally found our telescope. Let the revolution begin. Inspiring words. 8 years ago, I think, we were a little more excited about the revolution part than the reviewer part, but we've come, I think, to all agree that there's enormous potential in new types of data, both to answer old questions that were once thought to be unanswerable, but also a new genre of questions about new digital spaces. And so when we talk about digital trace data here at SICSS, we usually don't just refer to one of the more popular forms, which is social media data, so data that come from, say, Facebook, WeChat, Twitter, LinkedIn, and so on. Also web search data, a really interesting source of data that's being more broadly employed. Also advertising data from social media platforms that allows us to look at user behavior, little digital footprints of human behavior. Once upon a time, there were these things called blogs. Sometimes we study them. But it's important to note that the kind of digital revolution is not linked specifically to the internet. There's many new forms of data that have resulted from, for example, the digitization of administrative data or historical texts and archives. Many of you may know the Internet Archive or the Wayback Machine or the Common Crawl. These are all efforts to archive most of the internet, which really enables a lot of really interesting research. And if we're going to be hyperbolic about it, we could call it time travel, right? Going back and really being able to see the world as it was, at least online, and that's a big caveat, some years ago. And finally, digital trace data, I think, increasingly has come to encompass audio-visual data. So as we're watching, remarkable advances in image processing and machine learning, we're really able to pull out new features from audio-visual data, also NLP, which we're going to talk about tomorrow, which really move the needle. So what's new about these data? This is a picture that used to impress people. Now it's not so impressive anymore. This is Michael Macy's research. Michael Macy is a sociologist at Cornell who leads a lab that did some of the pioneering research in our field. And this is telecommunications data from Britain. More or less every phone call that was made in Britain for, I believe, a month. And here you're looking at the data actually mapping the country, right? Pretty unprecedented at the time. This came out around 2011. Similarly, many of us got really excited when we saw this map from Facebook. These are renderings of Facebook friendships across continents and across countries. This is made by a Facebook data scientist in, I think, 2012. And on the one hand, it's amazing that simple data points illuminate entire continents. On the other hand, it's quite obvious that certain continents are invisible. So, you'll note the relative absence of Facebook users in Africa and in Asia and in parts of South Asia. And, now that we've kind of begun to enter the hype cycle that Matt was talking about yesterday, where we once had peak expectations, and we were talking about doing crazy things like getting rid of theory because we have so much data. Now, much of our work is trying to figure out how to take advantage of the good things that come with digital trace data and get rid of the bad things. The reason we need to do that and develop hybrid approaches is manifold, but one of the main reasons is what Matt was talking about yesterday when he made a distinction between custom-made and ready-made data. So as you'll recall, Matt was saying that very often in conventional social science research, we create custom-made data. That means that we have a research idea from on high, we operationalize it, we do our own survey, we try as best as possible to do some kind of representative sampling, we try to control the conditions of an experiment, prevent interference, and so on and so forth, and we try to estimate a very neat causal effect. And in contrast, if that's like the Michelangelo of social science, if you'll remember from the analogy from bit by bit, the counterpart is the urinal, right? The ready-made data, something that is being repurposed for something else. And because I really can't stand this analogy, I prefer the Picasso. But the idea here, right, is that the data that we want to use to, say, track the spread of epidemics or understand social inequality or patterns of crime or the diffusion of ideas really weren't built for us. They were built by corporations to help people connect with each other or to enable commerce. And so a lot of what we need to do as we approach these data is think about kind of what we can take that's good and what we can jettison that's bad. So I'm going to move now into the second section of these slides.